And if I may ask you a question, what power with great power pretensions adopts wolf warrior diplomacy, who antagonizes Canada, Sweden, Norway, Australia, India? I could go on. And why?
You use words like wolf warrior diplomacy. And what's interesting is that while the term wolf warrior diplomacy is so frequently used in the Anglo-Saxon media, and as you know, the Anglo-Saxon media, let's be very blunt about this, has a very jaundiced view of China.
And what I'd like to ask you about is China is not just another great power. It is a Marxist-Leninist regime that under Xi Jinping has become very, very different than we experienced in the 80s, even in the 90s after the 1989 Beijing massacre and demonstrations.
I want to emphasize that there is only one country in the world that passes judgments on the internal political systems of other countries. It's a very exceptional country. And I think you all know of American exceptionalism. And even today, if you say that the United States will stand up to Communist Party's regimes, why are you cultivating Vietnam? What's the difference? Doesn't Vietnam also have a Communist Party in power? No matter what you do, the reality is that China, frankly, has already emerged as a great power. I don't buy the conventional wisdom in the Anglo-Saxon media, which is, by the way, always wrong on China. In 1990, when the economists first predicted the coming collapse of the Chinese economy, in 1990, the Chinese GNP was $360 billion. A few months ago, the economists again came out with a story saying the Chinese economic growth is over. But then it had grown to 18 trillion. It had grown 50 times after 30 years of predictions of the coming collapse of China. Why do I emphasize that? China's rise is unstoppable.
大家好，我是老吴。上一期节目中，我们分享了陈启宗和马凯硕的一场精彩对话。其中陈启宗提到了一个人和一件事，让我印象特别深刻。他说他见过的最精彩的时刻，就是看马凯硕先生是如何温柔地杀死一个名叫夏伟的美国学者的。我们先来听听陈启宗当时是怎么说的。
For those of you who haven't watched that, I encourage you to watch it. And Orville was hot-headed about China is bad, China is this, and then Kishore just killing him softly, did the job bloodlessly, except that when he walked out of the door, suddenly somebody found that there's blood all over him.
好，听完陈启宗的这段强烈推荐，相信很多朋友都迫不及待地想看看这究竟是怎样一场精彩的对话。在看视频之前，我给大家简单介绍一下这个夏伟。他在美国的学界和媒体圈里算是一个很活跃的人物，头衔也很多，比如加州大学伯克利分校新闻学院的前院长，美国亚洲协会中美关系中心的主任等等。几十年来，他频繁地来中国，也写了很多关于中国的书。听起来好像很了解中国，但实际上他的立场一直带着浓厚的西方意识形态偏见。在他的文章和讲话里，他经常用威权、列宁式这种标签来定义中国，完全无视中国在发展和治理上的成就。他还鼓吹所谓的中美接触政策已死，暗示美国应该对中国采取更强硬的立场。可以说他代表了美国老派精英那种根深蒂固的戴着有色眼镜看中国的傲慢。更过分的是，在这场对话中，这家伙竟然多次信口雌黄，用北京大屠杀这种词来形容80、90年代发生的事情，这纯粹就是在造谣。所以说这家伙不仅充满偏见，而且还相当坏，相当无耻。就是这样一个人物，当他遇到了马凯硕，结果会怎样呢？其实我频道刚建立的时候就分享过这场对话的一个小片段，不过那个时候频道刚起步，视频做的比较粗糙，字幕翻译也不够好，所以这一次我就重新做了一遍，内容更完整，让大家好好欣赏这场精彩的对话。好，接下来我们就一起来看看马凯硕是如何兵不血刃杀死夏伟的。
I think before you can answer the specific question about the direction of US-China relations, it's important to emphasize that we are dealing with it within a very, very different global context. And we have to understand this different global context if we're going to understand the dynamics that are also driving the US-China relationship. And there are at least three fundamental ways in which the world has changed now. Firstly, to put it very bluntly, the 21st century, where most of the US-China competition will take place, will be the Asian century. Now, what do I mean when I say it's going to be the Asian century? It means that the shift of economic power is going to move to Asia. The largest economies will be in Asia. And just to illustrate that point, in the 1960s, not so long ago, out of the top 5 economies, 0 were Asian. 0. Today, 3 out of the top 5 are Asian. And that future growth, as you know, is going to come from Asia. So that's one big shift that is happening. The secondly, on the geopolitical front, clearly we are moving from a unipolar world to at least a bipolar world. And I like to say that it's actually a bipolar world in a multipolar sea, because lots of other new powers are emerging, becoming more assertive. And so the unipolar moment that the United States enjoyed at the end of the Cold War is gone. But many people haven't adjusted to the fact that it is gone, and that you now have to live in a world where you have to contend with peer powers and other significant powers who are not necessarily going to bend to the wishes of the great powers so easily. So it's a much more complex world that we have to deal with. And thirdly, an equally important point, in the cultural dimension too, we are seeing some fundamental shifts that are happening, where we've had a world, in a sense, that has been dominated by one civilization, Western civilization, for the past 200 years, and Western states, as you know, colonized the whole. 100 years ago, if you were sitting here in 1924, the West ran the whole world effortlessly, right? Now you have a multi-civilizational world, where civilizations that have been dormant are re-emerging and coming back in strength. So even on the cultural front, it's a different world. So within this larger global context, we are also seeing the US-China contest. So why is it happening? The reason, quite simply, is that the United States is doing what exactly any number one power would do when it sees the emergence of a competitor. It makes sure that the competitor doesn't overtake it, so it is pushing it down. That's what all great powers have done. So what the US is doing is not surprising. It's predictable. And if you put X or Y, that's exactly what would happen, because the US has been used to being number one. It doesn't want to see displaced to another power. But at the same time, while this is predictable and expected, what is not clear to the rest of the world that is obviously watching this contest and is very worried about this contest, what exactly are the main strategic goals of the United States in this contest? You know, and this, frankly, as I say in my book, Has China Won? That insight I got from Henry Kissinger in a one-on-one conversation when I was writing my book, Has China Won? And Hamid, to some extent, you alluded to it in your remarks too. So, for example, is it the goal of the United States to stop the economic growth of China? Maybe that's why you have trade tariffs, chips, sanctions, and so on and so forth. Is that the goal? Can't be done. Or is it the goal to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? Again, I'll explain later, it can't be done. Or is it the goal to do what the United States did with the Soviet Union, contain it effectively, leave it confined to a small universe, and have it disengaged from the rest of the world? Again, as I'll explain later, it can't be done. So then at the end of the day, what the world is asking is, what exactly does the United States want to accomplish in this contest, and what will be the end game?
Okay, fantastic. Well, you've already put a lot on the table for us to come back and discuss, including fundamental changes, the rise of a multipolar system, the economic power and dynamism of Asia, new cultures, which I think is a really interesting point we should circle back to, but also raised a lot of questions about U.S. strategic goals. So, Orville, could you give us your perspective? What are the U.S. and China competing over, and why? What does the U.S. hope to achieve with this, and what is the end state that we're looking for?
Well, it's always a great pleasure to talk with Kishore because it immediately makes me think in ways that I don't normally have to think. The first thought that occurs to me after hearing your remarks is this. You ask, what's the United States' new strategy post-1972, I guess we could call it an engagement. I would like to ask you, what do you think China's strategy is? What are they after? Because actually, this is a dance between two partners. It isn't just up to the United States, as I'm sure you would agree. So what do you think China is after? And if I may ask you a question, what power with great power pretensions adopts wolf warrior diplomacy, who antagonizes Canada, Sweden, Norway, Australia, India? I could go on. And why? What's going on here? How is that in the advantage of anybody, much less China?
I was looking forward to the opening remarks of Orville.
Forgive me, Kishore,
I thought he would have some 7 minutes of prepared remarks.
I don't
give me some
you
time to
bait.
think. But I'm very happy, Orville, to answer your question. And if you don't mind, again, forgive me for doing this. When you talk about our world and how the world sees, especially what China's goals and strategies are, I want you to bear in mind a very important statistic, which is that 12% of the world's population lives in the West, and 88% of the world's population lives outside the West. And let me make one point very clearly and very boldly at the very beginning. How the 12% views China is not how the 88% views China. And so, for example, when you ask about what is China trying to accomplish, and if you want to if I can share with you what I pick up from my conversations with my fellow Asians, with Africans, with Latin Americans, they see that China is trying to come back once again as a strong civilization, which it once used to be. And China, he knows better than I do. He's the China expert. By the way, I'm not a China expert. Let me emphasize that one time. Immediately, I'm a China observer. And of course, we have to be China observers because in Southeast Asia, as you all know, geographically, the power that is going to have the greatest impact on us clearly is China. Just sheer proximity. Just as Latin America will live in the shadow of the United States of America, Southeast Asia has to live in the shadow, actually, of China and India, I must also emphasize. So our perspective, and that of other Africans, is that we've seen this civilization for 4,000 years go up, go down, go up, go down. And so the return of China is just part of a long 4,000-year history of dynastic cycles. And when the Chinese civilization goes down, it can go down very, very badly. And I think Orville knows better than any of us that they went through one of the worst centuries, the century of humiliation from 1842 to 1949. But it's not normal for the Chinese civilization to underperform for so long. It's much more normal for them to come back after a while. So what we see, therefore, from, let's say, from Southeast Asia, is the return of a civilization that we have seen for centuries go up and down. So this is a natural return. Now, so when China tries to claim a place in the world as one of the great powers, is a perfectly natural development. Now, you mentioned things, you use words like wolf warrior diplomacy. And what's interesting is that while the term wolf warrior diplomacy is so frequently used in the Anglo-Saxon media, and as you know, the Anglo-Saxon media, let's be very blunt about this, has a very jaundiced view of China, and the rest of the world discounts what the Anglo-Saxon media says about China. What the rest of the world does is to look at what China does and then deal with it. And at the end of the day, you will notice that countries have a choice. Do they want to trade with China, or do they not want to trade with China? And if you look at the deeds, China today does far more trade with the rest of the world than the United States does. By the way, we do want to have trade with the United States too. But trade, as you know, is a voluntary activity. But it benefits the countries that do it. So you take a country like Brazil, which is much, much closer to the United States than it is to China. 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. So why shouldn't Brazil have a normal trading relationship with China? So you can see, therefore, the point I'm trying to suggest to you is that if you look at many of the countries in the global south, not all, at many of the countries in the global south, they're very happy to have normal relations with China, and they have no difficulties. The difficulties have come, as I said, primarily between the United States and China for understandable reasons. This is what would happen when you have a great power shift. And I actually think that in some ways, just as what the United States did towards China was predictable, China's responses towards the United States are also predictable.
Of course, we live in a really interconnected world now, correct? Right? Where the kind of this narrative about the rise and fall of great powers ends up reverberating in different ways. Countries are very happy to trade with China, and I will turn to Orville in a minute for his thoughts on, how the U.S. sees China's behavior. But I, from my perspective, do not think that the U.S. Wants to hurt, hamper, harm China's legitimate trade with the world. But at the same time that countries are trading more with China, they're also seeking greater and greater security assistance from the U.S. Orville, could you break this down a little bit? What are some of the concerns about China's behavior as it rises that are causing this kind of demand signal for more U.S. Western attention, perhaps including some of the economic coercion activities you mentioned with Canada? And how do you see that in terms of China's rise in this system and its potential effects on global development moving forward?
I think, Kishore, I agree with you that, yes, China has every right to be a great power, and actually they've accomplished an amazing developmental success story. And I understand great powers never like to be deposed and replaced by others. But I think in your argument, and what I'd like to ask you about, is China is not just another great power. It is a Marxist-Leninist regime that under Xi Jinping has become very, very different than we experienced in the 80s, even in the 90s after the 1989 Beijing massacre and demonstrations. And I think that without factoring that element into the equation, we can't just blithely say, China wants to be a great power, wants to trade with everybody wants to trade with it, because there is another element in the equation, namely what China is after as a new kind of techno-autocracy in the world, and whether other countries feel comfortable with that. Now, we were talking upstairs a bit about the Philippines. I watch the Philippines extremely carefully because I see that as a kind of a Richter scale. I mean, Southeast Asia, fair enough. Singapore, caught in the middle, doesn't want to have to choose. Malaysia, I get it. But I think we may be approaching a point where it's going to be at least more difficult, if not impossible, to stand in the middle. And I think we see in the Philippines flickers of that recognition. Now, admittedly, the world is always in flux. So I'm curious to know how you view the internal political shift in China, where it is returning to a much more sort of Maoist mode, not completely so, and how other countries, the comfort levels they feel about accepting China's hegemony in Asia, if not in the world. Are you comfortable with this? I mean, Singapore is a small little country. How do you feel about that? Yes, you want to keep trading, but there are other factors here I think you have to take into consideration.
Well, first of all, let me, if you don't mind, quickly comment on the point you raised, Rory. When you mentioned that countries are also moving closer to the United States, you're absolutely right. I want to emphasize also, to avoid any misunderstanding, that there are huge reservoirs of goodwill globally towards the United States, and the world is actually quite happy to see a strong United States and a strong China, and to some extent, if they balance each other, that's not too bad for the world at large. So it's not as though the world is rushing to embrace China and saying goodbye America. That's not the world. The world, actually most countries in the world, as you yourself said, Orville, want to have good ties with both the United States and China. Now, in your point about the internal political makeup of China, and isn't China becoming more Marxist-Leninist or communist, and are we worried about that? And I think here I want to emphasize that there is only one country in the world that passes judgments on the internal political systems of other countries. It's a very exceptional country, and I think you all know of American exceptionalism. I can tell you that, the UN is not too far away from here. It's a mile or two away. If you walk into the United Nations, you will find that one of the most sacred principles of the UN Charter, which is actually held to very strongly by member states of the UN, is that we will not interfere in each other's internal affairs. That's enshrined in the UN Charter, and that principle is used by most states when they deal with each other. So the attitude of most states in the world is, you choose your form of government. No matter what you choose, we will deal with the government in power. And so whether China is more Marxist or less Marxist or democratic or undemocratic, we cannot get to choose. It's up to the Chinese at the end of the day choose what kind of government that they have. But I do think also, if I can, Orville, push a little bit back at you. When the United States first fell in love with China in 1971, can I ask you, who was the leader of China at that point? Was it Mao Zedong? Would you call Mao Zedong a great defender of human rights? Would you say that this is a man with a liberal mind, a liberal spirit, someone you can, develop a kinship with? You know what I'm getting at, right? So when it comes to geopolitics, it's a very cruel business. Ideology can be put aside when necessary, can be brought to the fore when necessary. And even today, if you say that the United States will stand up to Communist parties' regimes, why are you cultivating Vietnam? What's the difference? I mean, doesn't Vietnam also have a Communist party in power? So I'm only saying this because the rest of the world, when I say that the rest of the world has changed, they've become much more sophisticated. They see through all this. They see that, yes, there's a serious geopolitical contest going on between the United States and China. They are very worried about it. They want to maintain good ties with both, and they won't pass judgment. And it's not just, to be fair, Orville, it's not just Singapore. I can give you, if you want a list of 100 countries, I can give you a list of 100 countries that are in that position.
Could we talk a little bit about how countries are approaching this desire not to make a choice? Like, what are the factors, Orville, from your perspective, that are narrowing countries' options down into making a choice between the U.S. and China when it's clear that most countries don't want to choose or want to be able to maybe choose both? But also that it benefits both the U.S., China, and the world for there to be that type of cooperative tissue. What are some of the major irritants?
Well, before I get to the irritants, let me just say, Kishore, that 9 U.S. presidential administrations wholeheartedly supported engagement. And I take your point that, you know, we pick and choose who we oppose. But I think the difference is that Vietnam has no sort of hegemonic pretenses in the South China Sea, is not in conflict over the Senkakus, is not competing with the Philippines for Second Thomas Shoal, is not threatening to have some sort of a reunion with a forced reunion with Taiwan. And of course, I remind you that we've had a little dust up in India of late, and the entire Arunachal Pradesh in the Northeast Territories is claimed by China. They have maps with Chinese names on places. That shoe is going to drop. So it isn't that just China's a nice little authoritarian country wanting to trade with the rest of the world. It seems to me that what is agitating the situation and making it very difficult, not just for the United States, but is China's pretensions to rejuvenate in a way that has global aspirations, first in Asia and possibly elsewhere. We don't know. So I think that, you know, this is a very much more complicated thing than just China rejuvenating and restoring itself to a place of greatness. It is reaching out in ways which I think are very unsettling for Southeast Asia. And when I'm in Singapore, the thing that stuns me is I understand Singapore's situation, but actually, I mean, I think you Singaporeans, and I use you as a kind of a metaphor for many people in Southeast Asia, do feel rather profoundly comfortable with Americans, and actually many people feel rather uncomfortable with China, but it is you don't want to express it too loudly because you don't want to rock the boat. Fair enough, I get it. But I would love to hear you address what I think some would call China's hegemonic pretensions in Asia and the destabilizing effect of that throughout the entire region.
Do you think China is making the same mistakes that other industrialized countries are making, that they expand too far, too fast, that they try to wield the power that they've just received too quickly? And how does that uncomfortableness in Southeast Asia with some of China's behavior play out from your perspective?
Well, I can assure you that one lesson I learned after studying geopolitics for about 50 years is that the concept of a benevolent great power is an oxymoron. And there's no such thing as a benevolent great power. All great powers, without exception, and this has only been true for 4,000 years, will pursue their own interests. And we take it, in geopolitics, there are price makers and price takers. So United States and China today are price makers. We are price takers. And if we have any kind of illusion that there's a nice, benevolent, cuddly, great power that will look after you and sacrifice its own interests, then you're in trouble. So in geopolitics, which is a very cruel game, and the countries that don't understand geopolitics are the ones that get sucked into conflict and get sucked into problems. And here I want to add a very important point, because I think to some extent, Orville, you're being unfair to the Southeast Asian states. There are, at the end of the day, 660 million people living in Southeast Asia. That's about double the population of the United States of America. And this region of the world, I want to emphasize, is the most diverse region of planet Earth. Out of 660 million people, 250 million are Muslims, 150 million are Christian, 150 million are Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and as I told you, we have lots of communists also in Southeast Asia. If there was one region on planet Earth that should be destined for war and conflict, and the British describe it as the Balkans of Asia, that was Southeast Asia. Now, can you please ask yourself a simple question? Why have there been no major wars in Southeast Asia since 79? That's 45 years. There is a hidden genius in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. We know how to manage geopolitics. We know how to adjust, adapt, be flexible. We know how to maintain good ties with the United States, and we do. When President Biden invites the 10 ASEAN leaders, they come, right? And when President Xi invites the 10 ASEAN leaders, they go. And when Prime Minister Albanese of Australia invites 10 ASEAN leaders, they go. So if you want to learn, if you want to enter a world in which different cultures and civilizations want to learn how to live in peace with each other and can live in peace with each other, come to ASEAN. Come to Southeast Asia. Please don't be condescending towards this region. This region has accomplished some remarkable things that the whole world can take lessons from. And lesson number one, learn from us how to avoid wars.
First of all, I would say that I agree with you. Condescension towards anyone is not a helpful policy, and I don't want to think that we are condescending towards Southeast Asia, and I think actually quite the contrary, that we try to recognize that Southeast Asian countries are, as I said, stuck in the middle, and I think we understand that. And it's not, I think, the goal of the United States government to push people. But that still doesn't answer my question of China's pretensions, both within China and outside of China, and how you read those, and what you think the answer is as the middle ground shrinks. And ask the Koreans after what happened with the THAAD missile crisis, and they got punished. Ask the Japanese. Ask the Indians. I mean, you've seen this, you know this. So how should we respond to this? China is not just another normal quasi-democracy trying to find its way in the world and to rejuvenate and reattain great power status. It is a particular kind of a political structure with a particular kind of worldview. And I wonder, what you think the proper response to China is. Just let it alone? Pull back the 7th Fleet? Forget Taiwan? Forget the South China Sea? Forget the Senkaku Islands? Forget Philippines? Stop AUKUS? Stop the Quad? Do you think that's the proper response, or what's your remedy?
Well, Rory, this is getting very interesting.
I promised a lively discussion.
I'm very happy to answer the questions. But I'm going to give away a big secret. China is like any other country, an imperfect country. It makes mistakes. And I know, but as far as I know, all countries make mistakes. And it is true that China has had bilateral problems with several countries. There's absolutely no question whatsoever. And you're right, you have the list right. With Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Australia, and also with India. You're right. That's a list of about 5 or 6 countries, I think. Remember, at the end of the day, there are 193 countries in the world, right? And most countries have problems with some other countries. United States has problems with some countries. whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's North Korea, China. So this is normal. And for every country you give me a list, you mention, I can tell you which bilateral difficulties that country has. Greece and Turkey, if you want, India and Pakistan, if you want. So having bilateral difficulties is, by the way, a normal state of the world, right? So it is not surprising that China has bilateral difficulties. Sometimes it manages them well, sometimes it manages them badly.
Where
but
would you
all
say
countries
it's managed them well?
Well, I think certainly in the case of South China Sea, it has made mistakes. It has been far too assertive. And I think the biggest mistake the Chinese have made is in creating this 9-dash line. And the 9-dash line, I don't know if you all know this, there's a sort of a hypothetical line in the South China Sea that's been created by China, has no basis in international law, right? Now, if it is true that China claims all the waters within the 9-dash line as territorial waters, as some people claim that China is doing, then China shouldn't allow any international shipping through South China Sea. But I can assure you, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, ships are going through the South China Sea regularly without seeking permission of China, even though they're going through the 9-dash line waters. So the 9-dash line clearly is a huge mistake that China has made. But when you talk about the South China Sea, it's important to emphasize that the dispute that China has is with 4 ASEAN states. It's not a dispute, as you know, with the United States. And if you look at it, look at the 4 ASEAN states, in one way or another, they've been trying to manage it, whether it's Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Philippines. Now, right now, you are all focused on the current difficulties that Philippines is having with the United States. But you know, Orville, that Philippines elects one president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, that moves towards China. Then it elects another president, Aquino, who moves to the United States. And then it elects Duterte, who moves towards China. And then it elects Marcos, who moves towards United States. Can you anticipate what's coming next? Okay? So, so it's important to emphasize that don't take a snapshot. It's important to see the long-term picture. And at the end of the day, if South China Sea really is that dangerous, you should be seeing wars or gun battles and so on and so forth. But so far, everybody's been very restrained. But I can tell you this, Southeast Asia knows very well that when China comes back as a great power, as it has and as it's going to be, we have to make strategic adjustments. It's one thing to live next door to a mouse, fine. But when the mouse becomes an elephant, you worry about the elephant rolling over. And how do you manage that? And I can tell you that the Southeast Asian countries have had very long wisdom in how to manage China. And the one country, Orville, as you know, that knows China very well is Vietnam. Vietnam has been a neighbor of China for 2,000 years. It was occupied by China only 1,000 years. And you know what the Vietnamese say? The Vietnamese say that to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China. And you must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot be a leader of Vietnam. That's old wisdom. So I can assure you that we're not just going to become suckers and roll over and say, okay, do whatever you want, China. No, we're not that stupid. Okay? That we have our own ways and means. And frankly, if you look at a large country like Indonesia, also 260 million people, right? how does Indonesia get along with China? Indonesia, by the way, is a good friend of United States, wants to be a good friend of United States, and is also managing China. And if you want to watch subtlety and complexity, watch carefully what the Indonesians do. Then you understand that the Asians have a level of sophistication and subtlety that you'll never see, but it's real. And it works, and it prevents wars.
Orville, I want to turn back to you to try to get an answer to my original question. Oh, this has been a fascinating back and forth. I've really appreciated your views. Let me ask it in a slightly different way to try to elicit your response. What kind of China does America want and need in the world in order to stand up to China and get along with China?
Well, of course, America is also a very fickle country, an unpredictable country, and it's easy for us to think that it should act rationally, and maybe does act rationally sometimes, but it doesn't. I think, the ideal world was paradoxically and quite tragically the world we had, which was engagement. It was I think Henry Kissinger was absolutely right. He threw the switch. And he didn't call it engagement then. We didn't know about engagement yet, but it became that. And the conceit of engagement was, let's accept each other more or less, let's trade, let's exchange, let's try to get along and slowly see if we can't get on a more convergent pathway. And I think you all know that America actually, this was, I think, a really good example of American leadership. And I will remind you, after the Beijing massacre, what did President Bush do, who was at the initial, before we had an embassy, he was in Beijing representing the United States. He sent Brent Scowcroft to see Deng Xiaoping secretly. Didn't even tell Ambassador Jim Lilly that they were going. The transcript of that meeting is very telling, because what it shows us was Scowcroft really got berated by Deng Xiaoping, who actually I think is quite a hero. I don't want to malign him, but only to say that Deng saw the demonstrations as caused by the United States and was very abusive to Scowcroft, who was saying, please remember President Bush thinks of China. The China relationship is important, wants to continue it. I raise that only to say that I think the United States has gone the distance to try to find a way to do exactly what you propose, Kishore, which is to accept, maybe not completely, but to get along, work it out, see if the future can't hold a better future, a more congruent future. And I think what we see, if I may just quickly jump to the end here and then stop, is that in a certain sense, if I read this correctly, I think Xi Jinping has brought engagement to an end, sadly and tragically, both for us, for you, and for China. And I ask you why? How do you explain it? And that changes the game completely. So what are you going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? What's the right response now that we don't have an operating system for any kind of as Hamid said, we're compassless. What's the answer? You tell me.
Could you actually talk to us a little bit about where you think the U.S.-China relationship could more productively go? I mean, I think, Orville, a lot of the points that you've made, and also Kishore, the points that you've made have really pointed to a very deep strategic mistrust between the U.S. and China. We don't trust each other's political systems. China thinks the U.S. is fomenting color revolutions inside the PRC because of American democracy. The U.S. thinks that Chinese techno-authoritarianism could spread throughout the world. We don't have agreement on what we are doing with regard to our Taiwan policy. We're definitely interpreting each other's actions as aggressive when we see our own as defensive. So how do we manage the strategic mistrust? And maybe if we can throw in Orville's layer, how do we do it in the Xi Jinping era?
Yeah, great questions. Strategic mistrust, you're absolutely right. And I can tell you that this strategic mistrust between United States and China worries the whole world a great deal. Because at the end of the day, no matter what you do, the reality is that China, frankly, has already emerged as a great power. I don't buy the conventional wisdom in the Anglo-Saxon media, which is, by the way, always wrong on China. In 1990, when the economists first predicted the coming collapse of the Chinese economy, in 1990, the Chinese GNP was $360 billion. A few months ago, the economists again came out with a story saying the Chinese economic growth is over. But then it had grown to 18 trillion. It had grown 50 times after 30 years of predictions of the coming collapse of China. Why do I emphasize that? China's rise is unstoppable. And it's not driven by you or by me. It's driven by 1.4 billion Chinese people. And I'm sure you read the column by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times last week, in which he said, if 1.4 billion Chinese people decide to become prosperous, nothing can stop them. And the Chinese people have this great desire to do as well as the rest of the world. And so they have China, by the way, China's economy has serious problems. Property bubble, demographic challenges, lack of investor confidence. These are all real issues. But at the end of the day, what we have learned is that if there's one set of policy makers that seem to know how to fix their problems, gradually, it is China. Now, if you want me to answer your question directly, Orville, about President Xi Jinping, I want you to know that, again, I want to go back to my point of 193 countries in the world. Almost no other country in the world passes judgment on the quality of the leader that they are dealing with. They accept the fact that he is the leader and we have to deal with him. Good, bad, friendly, unfriendly. And frankly, I want to tell you this, if you don't mind, very directly. If you did a poll of 193 leaders and asked them in 2017, 2018, would you rather deal with President Xi Jinping or would you rather deal with President Donald Trump? I tell you, 193 countries would vote in favor of Xi Jinping. I'm serious. So when you emphasize that, it's a leader that's a problem, it's not the problem. You have to deal with a country. And I can tell you this, since I've spoken to many people, especially in third world countries, who have dealt with President Xi, they don't share your vision of President Xi. They see him as a sane, sober, rational, predictable leader who is advancing China's interests quite effectively. I mean, at the end of the day, you look at where China was when he took power, 2014, where China is 2024, it has come a long way. So whatever we do, we don't underestimate him or China. By the way, we also don't underestimate United States. I want to assure you that the respect for United States is deep and profound and very strong. But in the same way, there's also the same deep, profound respect for China. And we know we have to deal with these two great powers. And actually, we believe that the United States would be better off. Now, don't call it engagement, don't call it containment, just deal with the reality. The reality is that there is a strong, great power like China, and you have to live with it. And then figure out what's the best way of living with it in a way that enhances America's national interests. And I would say for America to defend its national interests is perfectly legitimate. Perfectly legitimate. But in many ways, the world would be happier that if given all the extraordinary challenges you're facing, for example, in climate change, you're the expert on climate change. The most sensible thing humanity could do is to tell the United States and China, please, we have a bigger problem coming. If we burn up planet Earth, we have nothing left to live on. We're destroying the only ship we have. Why don't we press the pause button on this geopolitical contest? Frankly, it's less important than the global challenges we face. So if you ask me what the rest of the world thinks, they actually hope that the United States and China could find ways and means of dealing with their differences in such a way that it doesn't destabilize the rest of the world and allows us to focus on what's really important that's coming in the future.